they'll never admit. The narcissist who replaced you, eventually they start resenting that new person and quietly obsessing over you because new supply doesn't fix their emptiness. It only delays it. And when the fantasy fades, guess who lives rent-free in their mind? You. If this is resonating, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Understanding this dynamic isn't about them. It's about protecting yourself from getting pulled back in. The illusion of new supply always fades because it was never built on reality to begin with. When a narcissist meets someone new, what they are chasing is not connection. It's relief. Relief from boredom. Relief from shame. Relief from the cracks in their carefully constructed identity. The new person becomes a mirror, reflecting back admiration, excitement, and possibility. In those early stages, everything feels electric. The narcissist appears attentive, generous, even transformed. But this intensity is not intimacy, it's performance. What fuels this phase is novelty. Novelty is powerful because it doesn't require depth. The new person hasn't yet seen the manipulation, the entitlement, the emotional inconsistency. They are responding to charm, to curated vulnerability, to grand promises. And the narcissist thrives in that environment because it allows them to control the narrative. They can be whoever they need to be to secure admiration. But novelty is temporary by nature. As the relationship progresses, the new person begins to have expectations. They want reciprocity, they want emotional presence, they want accountability, and this is where the illusion begins to crack. The narcissist cannot sustain the mask indefinitely because it requires constant effort and constant external validation. When admiration becomes routine instead of intoxicating, it stops delivering the same ego boost. The new supply eventually starts to resemble a real human being rather than an idealized reflection. They may question inconsistencies, they may express hurt, they may set boundaries, and to the narcissist, this feels like betrayal. Not because the partner has done something wrong, but because they have stopped serving as a flawless mirror. Disappointment creeps in. Irritation grows. The same devaluation that once happened to you begins again. The narcissist may convince themselves that this new person is flawed, ungrateful, insufficient. But what they are truly reacting to is the fading of fantasy. Without fantasy, they are left confronting the same internal emptiness they were trying to escape. Narcissists idealize the past when the present disappoints them because their emotional world is driven by comparison, not stability. When the current relationship begins to feel ordinary, demanding, or frustrating, they do not look inward and ask what they could do differently. Instead, they scan their history for a more flattering memory. The past becomes a curated highlight reel, carefully edited to soothe their wounded ego. This doesn't mean they suddenly develop insight or genuine nostalgia. It means the present has failed to maintain the illusion of perfection. When new supply no longer feels exciting or compliant, the narcissist experiences what feels like a personal slight. They interpret normal human behavior, fatigue, boundaries, emotional needs, as rejection. That sting activates their defense system, and one of their strongest defenses is rewriting the narrative. In that rewriting, you often become idealized. They may remember how attentive you were in the beginning, how much you tolerated, how strongly you admired them. They conveniently forget the conflict, the manipulation, the emotional exhaustion. Memory becomes selective because it serves a purpose: self-protection. If the present feels disappointing, then the past must have been better. And if the past was better, then the problem cannot possibly be them. This idealization of the past is unstable. It can shift quickly from praise to blame. One moment, you are the one who understood them better than anyone. The next, you are labeled difficult or ungrateful. The story changes depending on what their ego needs at that moment. What remains consistent is the function of the comparison to regulate their self-image. When they are dissatisfied, they reach backward, not out of love, but out of ego injury. The past becomes a psychological refuge where they can momentarily feel superior, desired, or in control again. But because this refuge is built on distortion, it never truly comforts them. It only deepens the cycle of dissatisfaction and comparison that keeps them emotionally restless. You represent a time when their false self felt powerful and admired. That is what lingers in their mind, not the real relationship, not the emotional damage, not the instability, but the version of themselves they were able to project when you were still invested. In the early phase, when you believed in them, supported them, defended them, or simply gave them consistent attention, their constructed identity felt solid. Your validation acted like scaffolding, holding up something fragile inside them. A narcissist operates from a split between a grandiose exterior and a deeply insecure core. The false self is the polished, confident, exceptional image they show the world. It requires constant reinforcement. When you admired them, when you were impressed by their charm, when you tolerated their behavior or gave them the benefit of the doubt, you were unknowingly stabilizing that false self. In their mind, that period becomes associated with strength, success, and control. But here's the distortion. They don't fully separate you from how you made them feel about themselves. You are not remembered as an autonomous human being with your own needs and complexity. You are remembered as an emotional resource, a source of admiration, a witness to their grandiosity. When that dynamic shifts, when you question them, withdraw, or stop feeding the image, it creates a rupture. And if you ultimately detach, that rupture becomes permanent. Later, when new supply doesn't provide the same intensity of validation or begins to challenge them, they feel that familiar instability again, and their mind drifts back to a time when the mask felt more secure. That time often includes you, not because they've developed empathy or remorse, but because you represent a period when their illusion felt intact. It's less about missing you and more about missing the reflected version of themselves they once saw in your eyes. New supply cannot erase the emotional imprint you left because narcissistic dynamics are not clean breaks. They are unresolved ego injuries. When a narcissist moves on quickly, it can look like you were replaceable, like the connection meant nothing. But internally, the story is more complicated. Narcissists do not process endings in a healthy, reflective way. They suppress, deflect, and distract. And distraction is not the same as healing. When you were in their life, there were emotional exchanges that shaped their internal narrative. You saw certain vulnerabilities. You witnessed inconsistencies. You may have confronted behaviors others ignored. Even if they dismissed you or devalued you, the fact that you engaged with them deeply creates an imprint. That imprint is not about love, it's about exposure. New supply can temporarily cover that exposure with novelty and validation. But covering is not erasing. The human brain doesn't simply delete emotionally charged experiences, especially ones tied to shame or ego threat. If you challenge their superiority, if you withdrew admiration, if you left on your own terms, that becomes a psychological bruise. And bruises linger beneath the surface. So even while they are idealizing someone new, parts of their mind are still negotiating the unresolved feelings connected to you. They may replay arguments, they may mentally justify their behavior, they may fantasize about proving something to you indirectly. This is not closure. It's rumination driven by ego regulation. What makes the imprint stronger is unfinished control. If they feel they lost power in the ending, if they didn't get the final word, if you stopped reacting, that lack of dominance sticks with them. Narcissists are deeply uncomfortable with situations where they are not in control of the narrative. New supply may provide distraction, but it does not rewrite the past. The emotional imprint remains because it is tied to identity, not attachment. And identity wounds are not easily replaced by fresh admiration. Narcissists resent anyone who exposes their limitations because their entire psychological structure is built around denying those limitations exist. At the core, there is a fragile sense of self that cannot tolerate imperfection. So they construct a grand, inflated identity, competent, superior, exceptional. This identity must be protected at all costs. When someone sees through it, questions it, or simply refuses to endorse it, that protection system goes on high alert. Exposure doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it's subtle. You may have noticed inconsistencies. You may have stopped applauding achievements that didn't match reality. You may have asked for accountability when promises were broken. To a healthy person, those are normal relational behaviors. To a narcissist, they feel like threats. Because when you highlight a limitation, even gently, you activate shame, and shame is intolerable for them. Instead of processing that shame, they convert it into anger or resentment. It's psychologically easier to label you as critical, disloyal, or difficult than to accept that you've identified a weakness. The resentment grows not because you harmed them, but because you disrupted their illusion of superiority. Over time, this resentment can intensify. They may replay moments where you challenge them. They may distort memories to make themselves the victim. They may tell others that you never supported them or always doubted them. These narratives are defensive maneuvers designed to restore their ego balance. Ironically, the people they resent the most are often the ones who saw them most clearly. When you no longer accept the mask at face value, you become dangerous in their internal world. You represent the possibility that others might see what you saw. That is why even after moving on, even after finding new supply, there can be lingering hostility. It's not about love lost, it's about a wound to their constructed identity. And anyone who has witnessed their limitations becomes a reminder that the grand image is not as invincible as they need it to be. Comparison becomes a silent obsession because narcissistic self-worth is not internally grounded. It is measured externally. They don't evaluate themselves based on stable values or authentic growth. They evaluate themselves by scanning the environment. Who admires me more? Who gives me more attention? Who makes me feel superior? This constant measuring creates a mental scoreboard that never turns off. When new supply enters the picture, the comparison begins immediately. At first, it favors the new person. The novelty, the excitement, the fresh validation create a surge of ego reinforcement. But as time passes and the intensity normalizes, the mind starts looking backward. How did you respond in similar situations? Were you more compliant, more impressed, more tolerant? These comparisons are rarely conscious or logical. They are emotional calculations designed to regulate self-esteem. If the new person sets firmer boundaries than you did, resentment builds. If they don't provide the same level of admiration you once gave, dissatisfaction grows. The narcissist may not openly admit they are comparing, but internally, they are constantly weighing who reflects them better. It becomes less about the individual partners and more about which one sustains the grandiose image more effectively. This comparison doesn't stop with romantic partners. They may compare careers, lifestyles, social media presence, or perceived happiness. If they believe you are thriving without them, the obsession intensifies. Your progress becomes an ego threat. If they believe you are struggling, they may feel a twisted sense of validation. Because their identity is unstable, they rely on comparison to feel anchored. But comparison is inherently unstable. There is always someone who reflects them better in the moment until that reflection fades too. So the mental scoreboard keeps shifting, never offering lasting satisfaction. And in that restless evaluation, you remain part of the equation, not as a person they deeply understood, but as a benchmark against which their ego continues to measure itself. Their lack of object constancy keeps them emotionally unstable because they struggle to hold a balanced, steady view of people when those people are not actively meeting their needs. In healthy emotional development, object constancy allows someone to maintain a sense of connection and security even during conflict or distance. It means you can feel upset with someone and still remember that they care about you. You can be apart and still feel bonded. Narcissists often lack this stability. For them, people exist in extremes. When someone is validating, attentive, and admiring, that person is good, valuable, even idealized. But the moment that validation drops because of disagreement, boundaries, or simple human imperfection, the internal image shifts. The person becomes disappointing, frustrating, even hostile in their perception. This rapid flipping between idealization and devaluation creates emotional chaos not only for their partners, but for them as well. Without object constancy, they cannot internally soothe themselves during moments of relational strain. They depend on external reassurance to regulate their emotions. If that reassurance is absent, it feels like abandonment, not mild disappointment, abandonment. That intensity pushes them to react impulsively, withdraw affection, lash out, or seek new supply to restore equilibrium. This instability also explains why memories of you can resurface unpredictably. When new supply is physically present and validating, they may barely think of you. But the moment there is tension, distance, or perceived rejection, their emotional system scrambles for prior sources of regulation. You reappear in their mind not because of steady affection, but because their internal world cannot maintain continuity. They do not hold a consistent emotional narrative about people. Instead, their perceptions fluctuate based on how regulated they feel in the moment. And since their regulation depends heavily on external input, their relationships are marked by dramatic swings, unresolved attachments, and a constant search for someone to stabilize feelings they never learned to stabilize within themselves. Their haunting memories are about ego injury, not love. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because from the outside, rumination can look like longing. If they think about you, mention you, stalk your social media, or circle back months later, it's tempting to interpret that as unresolved feelings. But what lingers in them is not heartfelt attachment. It is the sting of narcissistic injury. An ego injury happens when their grandiose self-image is threatened. Maybe you left first. Maybe you stopped chasing. Maybe you confronted behavior they wanted to deny. Maybe you simply became indifferent. Indifference especially cuts deep because it communicates that they are no longer central, no longer powerful, no longer impactful in your emotional world. For someone whose identity depends on significance, that feels intolerable. So the mind keeps returning to the injury site. They replay conversations, not to understand your pain, but to analyze where they lost control. They revisit memories, not to cherish intimacy, but to restore a sense of dominance in the narrative. Sometimes they fantasize about you regretting the breakup. Sometimes they imagine themselves thriving spectacularly so you will feel the loss. These mental loops are attempts to repair wounded pride. Love requires empathy, mutual recognition, and the ability to value someone's separate reality. Ego injury is self-focused. It asks, how did this affect me? How did I look? How could they stop validating me? When they are haunted, it is by unanswered questions about their own status, not by tender reflections about shared vulnerability. This is why they can appear nostalgic one moment and cruel the next. The memory is tied to self-esteem regulation. If remembering you soothes their ego, they may idealize the past. If remembering you intensifies shame, they may vilify you instead. What remains constant is the self-centered lens. The haunting is not about missing your presence. It is about trying to neutralize the wound your departure created in their fragile sense of self.